Thanks, everybody, for being here live from Washington, D.C., where we just set up temporarily while my father has some health struggles and I had to be here to support. So I appreciate everybody. I appreciate everybody's tolerance with this sort of makeshift format. This is someone who we adore, and his takes are just so clean. And he's a Pulitzer Prize winner, best-selling author, a Trumpologist, among other things. But when it comes to government, when it comes to money, when it comes to processes involving the law and government, he is without peer. Please, a welcome for David Cay Johnston, everyone. Hi,
Hello,
David
Mark.
Cay Johnston. Hey, David, I was curious, and I don't know the answer to this, but I mean, with every cell in my body, I have to think that you agree with me that this State of the Union address has outlived its usefulness and now has become something else.
Well, there's no requirement to have a State of the Union address. All that's required is for the executive, the president, to make a report to Congress. And back in the earlier days of the Second American Republic, that was sometimes done by just sending over a letter or a memo, basically. These things get so packed with detail that they sort of don't mean anything anymore. And your fundamental point you made in the previous segment, I think is absolutely crucial. There's a new survey I saw referenced last night on TV on I think it was Chris Hayes. 62% of Democrats, or 62% of Americans, it really doesn't matter which in this case, don't think Joe Biden has accomplished anything. Wow, 12 million jobs in 2 years. In Trump's first 2 years, it was a little over 2 million jobs. That's a tremendous accomplishment. We're seeing the return to the United States of microchip making. We're paying a lot of subsidies to do it, but we're at least getting it back. The supply chain issues have been largely improved. And I think those will get better as we move more operations back from China, Vietnam, other places here. And of course, that will mean more jobs at better wages than we've had. And the economy is doing so well. My goodness, last month, 517,000 jobs, and they revised upward the November and December numbers. It is unbelievably sound economy, with one stunning exception that's been around for a long, long time. And that is inadequate wages for millions of workers. The median wage, that means half make more, half make less. The median wage in 2021, which is the latest data, was $37,500. So a little over $3,000 a month. Now, if there's two people working, okay. But two-thirds of workers made less than that. That includes part-time workers. And there are lots of people who work part-time and they're fine economically for other reasons. They're retirees, they have a spouse with a decent income, they have inheritance, whatever. But we have a real fundamental problem with wages. And 82% of all the pay raises in America in 2020, that was an unusual year, pandemic year. Nonetheless, 82% of all the pay raises in America in 2020 went to people already making $1 million a year. And in 2021, it was 29% of all the raises. And the average raise in that group, just the raise, was $840,000. The people in the $1 million and up club are now getting 7% of all the wages in America, yet they are a tiny, tiny fraction of 1%. They're about a quarter of 1% of the workforce. And Mark, that's at the core of the problem, is because we don't have unions. You can clearly track what happened to wages in this country going like this in real terms as union density went downhill like this.
I thought that it's funny that you mentioned this, David. I didn't interrupt, but just on the union thing, and I know that that's something that you've done a lot of reporting on, and sort of the rise of labor. I thought we were getting to the point where labor was having a moment, in America. Recently, I'm talking about. Yeah. What happened to that?
Well, I think we are going to see more unions. The problem is we have a whole series of rules that make it incredibly difficult to organize union. And I've been on both sides of this, right? I'm the co-founder of a little hotel management company where we had workers, not a lot, 25. And I've been the head of a union and negotiated a contract at the Newspaper Guild. The laws that we have passed make it extremely difficult to organize unions. In fact, this is what I taught yesterday to my students at Syracuse University's College of Law, was employment law. And we have made it virtually impossible. It's astonishing to see that it's Amazon and some Starbucks. They have been able to organize workers because the law is so heavily tilted against workers. And, unions aren't perfect. There are lots of problems with many unions. Their quality and their integrity varies enormously. But guess what? The same exact thing is true of business. And
Right.
there is no union in America that brought in National Guard troops with machine guns to kill women and children who were the wives and families of striking coal miners, as happened in Ludlow, Colorado in 1913. There have been lots of incidents, none as bad as that, of corporations using violence to suppress their workers. There are some incidents of unions doing this, but they're much smaller and far fewer. And until we do something to increase wages, there are going to be a lot of people really hurt by our inflation. Well, a whole lot of people, it's not really affecting them. But there are people being very badly hurt. And it depends, on your circumstances. How much of your budget goes to food and rent? How much of your budget, on the other hand, goes to opera tickets and flying first class?
So let me see your opera ticket budget, and I'll tell you how much you make. So we circle back around. You have that carve out on the economy. That's I'd suggest, a systemic issue. The
Goes
problem
back
of
to the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. So
there's
it's 75 years old.
I mean, you'd have no president. I can't think of a situation in which that would be talked about unless Bernie Sanders was president, let's say. You know what I mean?
Well, Biden has talked about that. I mean, he is, on a relative scale, he's not where Bernie is, but he is the only actual pro-union president in my lifetime.
Well, he's talked about that. He's talked about minimum wage as well. Again, the follow through on it, it's harder. It gets caught up in the legislative grind of Washington. I guess what I mean is you won't hear it at a State of the Union, which is kind of what I wanted to get back to, because a State of the Union is, as I was saying, kind of this. It's a glossy vision of those things that the administration can claim as victory, and also those projects that the administration prioritizes. So, as you were saying to start, there's no requirement that it be done. By now, it's a chance, for the president to have a national audience and to try to make some of these points?
It's an opportunity for the president to showcase what he wants the public to see. And there will be a large audience for this tonight. It'll be a minority of American adults, but it'll be a large audience. There'll be a lot of discussion about it. I think the biggest problem with State of the Unions is simply that there's this effort to pack in a sentence here and a paragraph there, instead of stepping back and doing a great thematic speech. That's, if Biden were to start off and saying, 2 years ago, and here's what we've accomplished in just 2 years: 12 million additional jobs, more than 500,000 jobs just last month, bringing home the manufacture of critical to the digital age computer chips and similar materials. Yes, we've had to put up some subsidies to get this to happen, but in the long run, they will pay off. Whoa, will they pay off in terms of jobs and stability? And then forthrightly addressing the problems we have with food supply. And, one of the things I was looking for data just before you called on was California has a law now that you can't raise chickens for eggs in cages. You have to let them walk around. How much prior to this bird flu epidemic that caused us to kill millions and millions of chickens, how much more did it cost for a dozen eggs that were raised that way versus ones raised in cages? It's apparently a relatively minor cost. And if the chickens were roaming around free instead of in cages, we might not have all of this avian flu that results in killing all these chickens. Sometimes the industrial food processes we use appear to save money, but may not really, just on an economic basis. Never mind the feelings of the chickens.
Yeah, never mind the humanitarian. I I think there's a humanitarian crisis in that area, and I'd suggest that you're onto something, and you're because it applies not only to chickens, but it applies to all the animals used in the industrialized world of food production. They are all, they're wallowing in their own feces. It's a horrible, horrible setup. I'm talking about just for the health, leaving aside again the inhumanity of it.
Right, and there just came out a video that somebody got cameras inside at risk of their own life. It turns out instead of killing pigs the way we do cattle, which is you have essentially a stun gun, hits them in the head and they're gone instantly. They put them squealing and crying into a big chamber and inject carbon dioxide. And it takes about a minute for the pigs to die. I mean, it's just absolutely outrageous. And the industry says, oh, no, this is a humane way to kill the pigs. We're going to kill the pigs. That's accepted. But we shouldn't kill them in a manner like that. And I think if we look seriously at the way the industrial food operations work in America, we may find other areas that similarly, yes, they might add a little bit more to food inflation, but they might also result in fewer things like, these manure pits that have broken in a few places and flooded areas, and they stink up the community for miles around, and find better, smarter ways to do this. And of course, get more effective yields from crops.
Right, and you said a couple of things, and just to put a point on it, the pigs are among the, if not the most evolved creature mentally. They have a sense of themselves. They have a sense that it's the equivalent, they say, of a 2 or 3 year old child's cognitive development. So when you that just compounds the tragedy. But also on your point about just the runoff, the effluence that is the result of all of those farms. It poisons many streams and many agricultural concerns that aren't necessarily right next to these pig farms and these. The way it's sad. It's one more way in which we just seem obstinate as a culture to sort of move off the way we're doing things.
Well, because nobody who's a consumer of pork has a concentrated interest in these issues, but the people who produce it have a highly concentrated interest, and they want to capture the government regulatory agencies. They want them to say, oh, yeah, that sounds smart. Some of these agencies are not funded by the taxpayers. My favorite is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. When everybody else's budget was being held solid, and of course we have roughly the same number of federal workers today we did 70 years ago, despite the population being almost 3 times as large, or 2.8 times, I guess, as large. Their budget is paid for by the industry they regulate, and the commissioners come out of the energy industry, the electricity industry primarily, some natural gas and oil pipeline. And wow, they come up with rules that are antithetical to you and me, but they're sure beloved of the industry. Trying to get people to pay attention to that, I've been trying for 30 years, and total failure. Total complete.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's a total failure, David. You do get through, but you're right. It's
nothing changes.
It does feel as though nothing changes. Here in Washington, and by the way, it's a much more beautiful town now than when I was growing up here. The downtown area was a drab, awful administrative bore when I was a kid, and now it's got Art Deco buildings, and there's just a new vibrance and dynamic to Washington. And there's also a lot more lobby money. There's a lot. I mean, things through the decades have changed. But to your point, and regulatory capture, I was reading something this morning. I was going to talk about it on the show a little bit later. The fact that the insulin prices should be way lower than they are,
right.
And California may make some changes. We may start producing our own insulin, and we're not the only state. Other states are getting into it too, because industry has so cocooned itself from any kind of regulation, and they so have taken over the FDA that you end up with an inability to get reasonably priced, insurable insulin in this country.
I was reminded this morning of how lax the U.S. Patent Office is. They literally issued a patent once for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And so we have all sorts of drugs that after the patent period expires, they find a new usage for it. I just sent an economist friend of mine a chart on what one of those places advertised on TV like RX or
Right.
Single Care. It was a chart of drug prices. And the one I was struck by was sildenafil, otherwise known as Viagra. There are numerous places that have retail prices of $2,000 for 3 pills. And it was like, I don't believe this. So I called up my local Walgreens pharmacy and said, so what's the price for a normal dosage? Apparently is considered 6 a month. 6 pills, generic pills. Hold on a moment. Oh, that's $1,988. I said, you have got to be kidding. No. I said 1988, yes, and it's not covered by Medicare. I mean, this is just absurdity in terms of prices. And there are drugs that save lives. There's a very good story in today's New York Times. I think it's in the business section about, maybe it's in the science section, but it's about a woman who needs a drug that costs $200,000 a year. She's going to die. She has to pay $10,000 on her Medicare plan. That's the maximum limit. And she and her husband and a son, a nephew who's mentally disabled, all live on Social Security. They can't afford it. They don't have $10,000 a year for this. This is absurd. So she's going to die. And the real question to ask is, why is this drug costing $198,000? Maybe we should go to the drug companies and say, we're going to offer you rewards. Come up with a drug that does this thing we think needs to be done, and we'll hand you $10 billion. Of course, you can imagine what the Wall Street Journal and Fox News would say about that. And if you tried to get on and say, well, wait a minute, giving them $10 billion for this drug would save $90 billion, they'd say, but that's not the point.
And you wonder what that drug costs in other countries, you know?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, Americans subsidize the rest of the world. Absolutely. Because Congress under the George W. Bush administration, when it passed Part D of Medicare, said you cannot negotiate drug prices.
Right.
We effectively, as American taxpayers, are subsidizing the drug prices paid by the French and the Germans and the Japanese. And why would we do that?
It just also is pathetic that we don't allow people even to shop for lower cost drugs in Canada, for example. Those people who are like, you're not that far from Canada. I mean, I know it's
90 miles. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but you're not allowed to go over there to get lower cost medicines. It's a kind of protectionism of the of the worst sort. That puts the sweat on your own population.
And remember that much of the money drug companies tell you it costs to develop a drug. It's very expensive to develop a drug. Both my wife and I have volunteered for drug trials, and we got paid because there was a fair amount of work involved on our end. But these things are heavily funded by government. And we should require, at a minimum, we should say to the drug companies, you have to issue a statement documenting, and here's the rules you have to follow on how much of your development of a drug was taxpayer money, philanthropic money, and your own capital. How much are you using university research labs that the taxpayers are paying for? Now, so stop telling us that it cost X. It really cost a third of X or half or a quarter of X.
I'm wanting to ask you how to affect some of those changes, but I'm going to actually backburner that, and it's part of an ongoing conversation. Often we come back around to, well, David, what do we do? What do we do? Who do we? I want to ask you about an ongoing expense that we have as a country, and an imperative, some might say, to help Ukraine and to constrain this sort of Russian expansion. And yet you'll hear on the other side as well, look, NATO expansion is what led to Russia being backed into a corner, to which I might say, well, yeah, but, even if I accept that as true, NATO didn't fire the first shot at Russia in any way. I mean, this is it feels as though this is a pretty ruthless procession of carnage that Putin is leading. So increasingly, this gets to my point, but I just wanted to kind of set the scene. My question is, do you feel that American appetite for support of Ukraine is beginning to, and this is something that he may visit tonight in the State of the Union, Biden, is beginning to reach a limit or is beginning to turn? What's your sense of that?
I don't know. But let me make a more important underlying point. It is not the expansion of NATO that led to this invasion. Vladimir Putin has been on the record again and again and again, going back long before any expansion of NATO, that he was going to put the old Soviet Union back together. And he is clearly willing to do so by force. And I have, in the last 2 years, been studying Russian military history, not real heavily, but gotten some material on it and some guidance from retired military scholars. And this is the way Russia has always conducted war. Back when the czars were around, you go in and you attack the civilian population, you murder children, you rape and then kill women. You pay no regard to, in the modern world, the law of war at all. And you hire these ruthless groups like the mercenaries, the Wagner group, where they went and got all these people out of prison and said, serve in the Ukraine war and then we'll set you free. Gee, that's a comforting thought. A bunch of murderers and pedophiles are going to be in my neighborhood if they survive the war. There are also very credible reports now showing that some of the Russian units with these ill-trained troops are suffering 80% casualties. Casualties are both killed and wounded. But any unit that has 80% casualties, you're not going to have any cohesion or coordination. Kim just mentioned that it was 1,000 people in the latest report. It's believed Russian side soldiers were killed
In 24 hours.
In just 24 hours. And the Russians are running out of material. They've been calling up tanks that have been coated in grease and put away from World War II. If we don't, exactly what it says on the screen today, if we don't back Ukraine today and stop this, this will go on for decades. And Moldova, the old Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, they're all going to come under the same kind of assault. We have to do this now. We have to give the Ukrainians the necessary weaponry. And by the way, I had dinner with a retired military officer who was in war planning in the end of his career 2 nights ago. And he said something absolutely fascinating. 500 years from now, every war college in the world will be training, how did the Ukrainians do this? How did this relatively small country overcome this army? And part of it is the horrible corruption and lack of discipline and training in the Potemkin army of the Russians. But more significant is that they had their own military officers trained not by the Russians, but by the British and the Americans and the French and the Poles. And they've done much better. And the reader, Randy Burling, is asking, how much does it cost? There is no price on freedom. That's
so I'd also challenge those numbers a little bit.
Down in the short run, save some billions, tens of billions of dollars, but you will be paying for the next 50 or 60 or 100 years. And that's the way you need to look at this. We have to stop Putin here and now, or he and his successors will continue trying to put the old Soviet Union back together, take away people's freedom, and increase their power in the world.
Yeah. Karen says the war doesn't just involve Ukraine, but many other countries, just as in World War II. That's the point you were making, David Cay Johnston. We're helping to defend a large part of the world. Look, I've got to let you go. I so enjoy our time, and you can tell our listeners and viewers do as well. Check out dcreport.org. That's David's website that he co-founded. And thanks for being with us every Tuesday, David. Love talking to you.
Go SoCal.
David Cay Johnston. Yeah. SoCal.
SoCal. Go SoCal. SoCal Knights.
SoCal shirt. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.